In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I am inclined to reserve all judgments. A habit that has opened up many curious natures to me and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person. And so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently I have feigned sleep preoccupation or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms in which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. I am still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggests, and as I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. And after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock of the wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt like I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that registers earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of the creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in this middle western city for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch, but the actual founder of my line is my grandfather's brother, who came here in '51 and is substituted the Civil War and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him with special reference to the rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in Father's office. I graduated from New Haven in 1915, just a quarter of a century after my father, and a little later participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. I enjoyed the counter raid so thoroughly I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now felt like the ragged edge of the universe, so I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed I could support one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me, and finally said why yes, with very grave, hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays, I came east permanently, I thought, in the spring of '22. The practical thing was to find rooms in the city, but it was a warm season, and I just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees, so when a young man at the office suggested we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found the house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow at $80 a month, but at the last minute the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went out to the country alone. I had a dog, at least I had him for a few days until he ran away, and an old Dodge, and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. It was lonely for a day or so until one morning some man more recently arrived than I stopped me on the road. "How do you get to West Egg Village?" he asked helplessly. I told him, and as I walked on I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so, with the sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I felt that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. There was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young, breath-giving air. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credits and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas Morgan and Maecenas knew. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News, and now I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again that most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man. This isn't just an epigram. Life is much more successfully looked at through a single window after all. It's a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It is on that slender, riotous island which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, 2 unusual formations of land. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour, jut out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. They are not perfect ovals like the egg in the Columbus story. They are both crushed flat at the contact end, but their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual wonder to the gulls flying overhead. To the wingless, a more interesting phenomenon is their complete dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. I lived at West Egg The, well, less fashionable of the two, though this is a most superficial tag to express the bizarre, not a little sinister contrast between them. My house is at the very tip of the egg, 50 yards from the Sound, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for 12 or 15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard, a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivory, and a marble swimming pool, and over 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion, or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore and had been overlooked, so I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. Across the Courtesy Bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water, and the history of the summer really begins in the evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I'd known Tom in college, and just after the war I'd spent 2 days with them in Chicago. Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven. A national figure in a way, one of those men who reached such an acute limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors of anticlimax. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter of reproach. But now they left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he brought in a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man of my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. Why they came east, I don't know. They'd spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then traveled here and there unrestfully wherever people played polo and were rich together. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on, forever seeking, a little wistfully, for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. And so it happened that on a warm, windy afternoon I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The front lawn started at the beach and ran towards the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walks and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the sides in bright vines, as if from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon, and Tom Buchanan in riding clothes was standing with his legs apart on the porch. He had changed since his New Haven years. He was now a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a rather hard mouth and supercilious manner. Two shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes couldn't hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and one could see a great pack of muscles shifting when his shoulders moved under his thin coat. His speaking voice, it was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of fractiousness he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even towards people he liked, and there were men at New Haven who had hated his guts. I don't think my opinion on these matters is final, he seemed to say, just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. We were in the same senior society, and while we were never intimate, I always had the impression that he approved of me and wanted me to like him with some harsh, defiant wistfulness of his own. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. We've got a nice place here, he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including in its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide offshore. It belonged to the domain, the oil man. He turned me around again politely and abruptly. We'll go inside. We walked through a high hallway into a bright rose-colored space, fragilely bound into the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleaming white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little ways into the house. A breeze blew through the room, blew the curtains in at one end and out at the other like pale flags, twisting them up towards the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippling over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as wind does on the sea. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. The younger of the two was a stranger to me. No, that's not right. That's not where that goes. I must have stood there for a moment, listening to the whippings, on which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering, like they'd just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. I must have stood there for a moment, listening to the whip and snap of the curtain, and the groan of a picture on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear window and the caught wind died out about the room, and the curtains and the rug and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. The younger of the two was a stranger to me. She sat at her end of the divan, extended full length, completely motionless. She sat at her end of the divan, extended full length, completely motionless, and with her chin raised a little. With her chin raised a little, as if she were balancing an object on it which was quite likely to fall. If she saw me out of the corner of her eye, she gave no hint of it. Indeed, I was almost surprised into murmuring an apology for having disturbed her by coming in. The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression. Then she laughed, an absurd, charming little laugh, and I laughed too, and came a little forward into the room. "I'm paralyzed with happiness." She laughed again as if she'd said something very witty. Then she held my hand for a moment, looking up into my face, promising there was no one in the world she so much wanted to see. That was a way she had. She hinted in a murmur that the surname of the balancing girl was Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean towards her, an irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. At any rate, Miss Baker's lips fluttered and she nodded at me almost imperceptibly. Again, a sort of apology rose to my lips. Almost any exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws stunned tribute from me. I looked back at my cousin, who began asking me questions in her low, thrilling voice. It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down, as if each speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Her face was sad and lovely, with bright things in it, bright eyes and a bright, passionate mouth. But there was an excitement in her voice that men who had cared for her found difficult to forget. A singing compulsion, a whispered listen, a promise that she had done gay, exciting things just a while since, and there were gay, exciting things hovering in the next hour. I told her how I'd stopped off in Chicago for a day on my way east, and how a dozen people had sent their love through me. "Do they miss me?" she cried ecstatically. "The whole town is desolate. All the cars have their left rear wheel painted black as a mourning wreath, and there's a persistent wail all night along the North Shore. How gorgeous! Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow." Then she added irrelevantly, "You ought to see the baby." "I'd like to. She's asleep. She's 3 years old. Haven't you ever seen her?" "Never." "Well, you ought to see her. She's..." Tom Buchanan, who'd been hovering restlessly about the room, stopped and rested a hand on my shoulder. "What you doing, Nick?" "I'm a bond man." "With who?" I told him. "Never heard of them," he answered decisively. This annoyed me. "You will," I said shortly. "You will if you stay in the East." "Oh, I'll stay in the East," he said, glancing at Daisy and then back at me as if alert to something more. I'll stay in the East, don't you worry," he said, glancing at Daisy and then back at me as if alert to something more. "I'd be a goddamn fool to live anywhere else." At this point, Miss Baker said absolutely with such suddenness that I started. It was the first word she'd uttered since I came into the room. Evidently it surprised her as much as it had me, for she yawned and with a series of rapid, deft movements stood up into the room. "I'm stiff," she complained. "I've been lying on that sofa for as long as I can remember." "Don't blame me," retorted Daisy. "I've been trying to get you to New York all afternoon." "No thanks," said Miss Baker to the tray of 4 cocktails just in from the pantry. "I'm absolutely in training." Her host looked at her incredulously. "You are?" He took down his drink as if it were the drop in the bottom of a glass. "How you get anything done is beyond me." I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what it was she got done. I enjoyed looking at her. She was a slender, small-breasted girl with an erect carriage which she accentuated by throwing her body backwards at the shoulder like a young cadet. Her gray, sun-strained eyes looked back at me with polite, reciprocal curiosity out of a wan, charming, discontented face, and I realized then that I'd seen her or a picture of her somewhere before. "You live at West Egg," she said contemptuously. "I know somebody there. I don't know a single..." "You must know Gatsby." "Gatsby?" demanded Daisy. "What Gatsby?" Before I could reply, he was my neighbor. Dinner was announced. Wedging a tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though moving a checker to another square. Slenderly, languidly, their hands set lightly at their hips, The two young women preceded us out onto the rosy-colored porch where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. "Why candles?" objected Daisy, frowning. "In 2 weeks it'll be the longest day of the year." She looked at us all radiantly. "Do you always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it?" "I always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it." "We have to plan something," yawned Miss Baker, sitting down at the table as if she were getting into bed. "All right," said Daisy. "What'll we plan?" She turned to me helplessly. "What do people plan?" Before I could reply, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her little finger. "Look," she said. "Hurt it." We all looked. The knuckle was black and blue. "You did it, Tom," she said accusingly. "I know you didn't mean to do it, but you did do it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man. A great big hulking specimen of a—" "I hate that word hulking," objected Tom crossly. "Even in kidding." "Hulking," insisted Daisy. Sometimes she and Miss Baker spoke at once, unobtrusively, with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter, that was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes and the absence of all desires. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, making only a polite, pleasant effort to entertain or to be entertained. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase towards its close in a continually disappointed anticipation, or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. "You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy," I confessed after my second glass of corky but rather impressive claret. "Can't you talk about crops or something?" I meant nothing in particular by this remark, but it was taken up in a peculiar way. It was taken up in an unexpected way. "Civilization's going to pieces," broke out Tom violently. "I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about everything." "Have you read Rise of the Colored Empire by this man Goddard?" "Why, no," I stammered, surprised by his tone. "Well, it's a fine book, and everybody ought to read it. The idea is if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved." "Tom's getting very profound," said Daisy with an expression of unthoughtful sadness. "He reads deep books with long words in them." "What was that word "Well, these books are all scientific," insisted Tom, glancing at her impatiently. "This fellow's worked out the whole thing." It's up to us who are the dominant race to watch out, or these other races will have control of things." Damn it, I was watch out. So we have control of things. "You ought to live in California," began Miss Baker, but Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. "We've got to beat them down," whispered Daisy, winking ferociously into the fervent sun. "This idea is we're Nordics." "We've got to beat them down," whispered Daisy, winking ferociously into the fervent sun. "You ought to live in California," began Miss Baker, but Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. "This idea is we're Nordics. I am, and you are, and after an infinitesimal hesitation, he included Daisy with a slight nod. She winked at me again. "And we've produced all the things that go to make civilization. Oh, science and art and all that. Do you see?" There was something pathetic in his concentration, as if his complacency, more acute than of old, were no longer enough for him. When almost immediately the telephone rang inside and the butler left the table. Daisy seized upon the momentary interruption and leaned forward to me excitedly. "I'll tell you a family secret," she said. "It's about the butler's nose. Would you like to hear about the butler's nose? That's why I came over tonight." "Well, he wasn't always a butler. He used to be the silver polisher for a group of people in New York who had a silver service for over 200 people, and he had to polish from morning till night until it began to affect his nose. Things went from bad to worse," suggested Miss Baker. "Yes, things went from bad to worse, until finally he had to give up his position. For a moment, the last sunlight fell with romantic affection upon her glowing face. voice compelling me breathlessly forward as I listened. Then the glow faded, each light leaving her face with lingering regret, like children leaving a pleasant street at dusk. The butler came back, murmured something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, pushed back his chair, and without a word, went inside. As if his absence stirred something within her, as if his absence quickened something within her, Daisy leaned forward excitedly again. "I'll have to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose, doesn't he?" She turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. "An absolute rose?" "This is untrue. I am not even faintly like a rose." She was only extemporizing, but a stirring warmth flowed from her as if her heart were trying to come out to you, concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. Then suddenly she threw down her napkin on the table, excused herself, and went into the house. Miss Baker and I exchanged a short glance, consciously devoid of meaning. I was about to speak when Miss Baker sat up alertly and said "shh" in a warning voice. "This Mr. Gatsby you spoke of is my neighbor," I began. "Don't talk," she said. "I want to hear what happens." "Is something happening?" I inquired innocently. "You mean to say you don't know?" she said, honestly surprised. "I thought everybody knew." "I don't." "Why," she began hesitantly, "Tom's got some woman in New York." "Got some woman," I repeated blankly. She nodded. "She might have the decency not to telephone him at dinner time, don't you think?" Almost before I grasped her meaning, there was the crunch of a leather boot, and the flutter of a dress, and the crunch of a leather boot, and Daisy and Tom were back at the table. "Couldn't be helped," cried Daisy with tense gaiety. She glanced searchingly at Miss Baker and then at me, and then continued, "I looked outdoors for a minute. It's very romantic outdoors. There's a bird on the lawn. I think it must be a nightingale come over on the canard of the White Star Line. And he's singing away." Her voice sang. "It's romantic, isn't it, Tom?" "Very romantic," he said, and then miserably to me, "If it's light enough after dinner, I'll take you down to the stables." The telephone rang again, startlingly, and as Daisy shook her head decisively at Tom, the subject of the stables, in fact all subjects, vanished into air. Among the broken fragments of the last 5 minutes at table, I remember the candles being lit again, pointlessly, and I was conscious of wanting to look squarely at everyone and yet to avoid all eyes. I couldn't have guessed what Daisy and Tom were thinking, but I doubt if even Miss Baker, who seemed to have mastered a certain hearty skepticism, was able utterly to put this fifth guest's shrill metallic urgency out of mind. To a certain temperament, it might have been intriguing. My own instinct was to telephone immediately for the police. Needless to say, the horses weren't mentioned again. After dinner, Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled back into the library, as if to a vigil beside a perfectly tangible body. While, trying to seem interested and a little deaf, I followed Daisy around a series of connecting verandas to the porch in front. In its deep gloom, we sat down side by side on a wicker settee. Daisy took her face in her hands as if feeling its lovely shape, and her eyes moved gradually out into the velvet dusk. I saw that turbulent emotions possessed her, so I asked what I thought would be sedative questions about her little girl. "We don't know each other very well, Nick," she said suddenly. "Even if we are cousins, you didn't come to my wedding. I wasn't back from the war." "That's true," she hesitated. "Well, I've had a very bad time of things, Nick. And I've gotten to be pretty cynical about everything." Evidently she had reason to be. I waited for a moment, but she didn't say anything. So I returned rather feebly to the subject of her little girl. "I suppose she talks and eats and everything?" "Oh yes," she looked at me absently. "Listen, Nick, Let me tell you what I said when she was born. Would you like to hear? Very much. It'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things. Well, she was less than an hour old, and Tom was God knows where, and I woke up out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling. And I turned to the nurse right away and asked if it was a boy or a girl. She said it was a girl, and I turned my head away and wept. All right, I said, I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool. You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow, she went on in a convinced way. Everybody thinks so, the most advanced people, and I know so. I've been everywhere and done everything and seen everything. Her eyes flashed about defiantly, rather like Tom's. She laughed with thrilling scorn. Sophisticated. God, I'm sophisticated. The instant her voice broke off, ceasing to compel my attention, my belief, I felt the basic insincerity of what she had said, as if the whole evening had been a trick of some kind to exact contributory emotion from me. I waited for a moment, and sure enough, in a moment, she looked at me with an absolute smirk on her lovely face, as if she had just asserted her membership into a rather distinguished secret society to which she and Tom belonged. Inside, the crimson room bloomed with light. Tom and Miss Baker sat at either end of the long couch, and she read aloud to him from the Saturday Evening Post, the words, murmurous and uninflected, running together in a soothing tone. The lamplight, bright on his boots and dull on the autumn leaf yellow of her hair, glinted along the paper as she turned the page with a flutter of the slender muscles in her arm. When we came in, she held us silent for a moment with a lifted hand. To be continued, she said, tossing the magazine on the table, in our very next issue. Her body asserted itself with a restless movement of her knee. 10 o'clock, she said, apparently finding the time on the ceiling. Time for this good girl to go to bed. Jordan's going to play in the tournament tomorrow, explained Daisy helpfully, over at Westchester. Oh, you're Jordan Baker. I knew now why her face had been familiar. Its pleasing, contemptuous expression had gazed out at me from many rotogravure pictures of the sporting life at Asheville and Palm Springs. At Asheville and Hot Springs and Palm Beach. I'd heard some story of her too. Critical, unpleasant story. But what it was, I'd forgotten long ago. Good night, she said. Wake me at 8, won't you? If you'll get up. I will. Good night, Mr. Carraway. See you anon. Of course you will, confirmed Daisy. In fact, I think I'll arrange a marriage. Come over often, Nick, and I'll sort of fling you two together. Oh, lock you up accidentally in linen closets, push you out to sea in a boat, that sort of thing. Good night, called Miss Baker from the stairs. I haven't heard a word. Nice girl, said Tom. They oughtn't to let her run around the country this way. Who oughtn't to? Her family. Her family is one aunt about 1,000 years old. Besides, Nick's going to look after her, aren't you, Nick? She's going to be spending a lot of weekends out here this summer. I think the home influence will be very good for her. Tom and Daisy sat for a moment in silence. Is she from New York? I asked quickly. From Louisville. Our girlhood was spent there together. Our beautiful white... Did you give Nick a little heart-to-heart on the veranda? Demanded Tom suddenly. Did I? She looked at me. I can't seem to remember, but I think we talked about the Nordic race. Yes, it just sort of crept up on us, and first thing you know... Don't believe everything you hear, Nick. I said I hadn't heard anything, and a few moments later, got up to go home. They followed me to the door and stood in a cheery square of light. As I started my motor, Daisy peremptorily called, Wait, we forgot to ask you something. We heard you were engaged to a girl out west. Yes, corroborated Tom kindly. We heard you were engaged. That's right, corroborated Tom kindly. We heard you were engaged. It's a libel, I'm too poor. But we heard it, said Daisy, surprising me by opening up in a flower-like way. We heard it from 3 people, so it must be true. Of course, I knew what they were referring to. The fact that gossip had published the banns was one of the reasons I'd come east. you can't stop going with a friend because of rumors, and on the other hand, I had no intention of being rumored into marriage. Nevertheless, their interest made them seem less remotely rich. Their interest rather touched me and made them seem less remotely rich. Nevertheless, I was uneasy and a little disgusted as I drove away. It seemed to me the thing to do was for Daisy to run from the house child in arms. But evidently there was no such intention in her head. As for Tom, the fact that he had some woman in New York was rather less surprising than the fact that he had been depressed by a book. Something was causing him to nibble at the edge of stale ideas, as if his sturdy physical egotism no longer nourished his peremptory heart. Already it was well into summer on roadhouse roofs and at wayside garages, where new red gas pumps sat out in pools of light. When I arrived at my estate at West Egg, I ran the car under its shed and then sat for a while on an abandoned grass roller in the yard. The wind had blown off, leaving a loud, bright night, with wings beating in the trees and the full bellows and a persistent organ sound as the full bellows of the earth blew the frogs full of life. The silhouette of a moving cat wavered in the moonlight, and turning my head to see it, I realized I was not alone. 50 feet away, a figure had emerged from the shadow of my neighbor's mansion, with his hands in his pockets regarding the silver pepper of the stars. Something in his leisurely movements and the secure position of his feet upon the lawn suggested it was Gatsby himself, come out to determine what share was his of our local heavens. I decided to call to him. Miss Baker had mentioned him at dinner, and that would do for an introduction, but I did not call to him, for he gave the sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He stretched his arms out toward the dark water in a curious way, and, far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was trembling. Involuntarily, I glanced seaward and distinguished nothing, except a small green light, minute and far away, that might have been the end of a dock. When I looked for Gatsby once more, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness. Chapter 2. About halfway between West Egg and New York, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs alongside it for a quarter of a mile so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. This is a valley of ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens, where ashes take the form of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and, with transcendent effort, the form of ash-gray men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. Occasionally, a line of gray cars crawls along an invisible track, gives out a ghastly creak, comes to rest, and immediately, ash-gray men with leaden spades swarm up and stir up an impenetrable cloud which screens their obscure operation from your sight. But above the gray land and the spasms of bleak dust that drift endlessly over it, you perceive after a moment the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. The retinas are 1 yard high, and they look out of no face, but instead out of a pair of enormous yellow spectacles which pass over a non-existent nose. Evidently some wild wag of an oculist had set them there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into eternal blindness, or else forgot them and moved away. But his eyes, dimmed a little by many paintless days under sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. The Valley of Ashes is bounded on one side by a small foul river, and when the drawbridge is up to let barges through, passengers in the waiting trains can stare at the dismal scene for up to half an hour. There is always a halt here of at least a minute, and it is because of this that I first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. The fact that he had one was insisted upon wherever he was known. His acquaintances resented the fact that he turned up in popular cafes with her, and, leaving her at a table, sauntered about, chatting with whomsoever he knew. Though I was curious to see her, I had no desire to meet her, but I did. I was taking the train. One afternoon, I was taking the train to New York. I was taking the train with Tom up to New York. When we stopped by the ash heaps, he leapt to his feet and, taking hold of my elbow, literally forced me from the car. "We're getting off," he insisted. "I want you to meet my girl." The supercilious assumption was that on a Sunday afternoon, I had nothing better to do. I suspect he'd tanked up a good deal at luncheon in his determination to have my company bordered on violence. The supercilious assumption was, on a Sunday afternoon, I had nothing better to do. I followed him over a low, whitewashed railroad fence and back along the road 100 yards or so under Dr. Eckelberg's persistent stare. The only buildings in sight was a small block of yellow brick on the edge of the wasteland. A sort of main street ministering to it and contiguous to absolutely nothing. One of the shops it contained was for rent, and another was an all-night restaurant approached by a trail of ashes, and the third was a garage. Repairs, George B. Wilson, cars bought and sold, and I followed Tom inside. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car that was visible was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford that crouched in a dim corner. It occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead, when the proprietor himself appeared in the door of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. He was a blond man, anemic and faintly handsome. He was a blond, spiritless man, anemic and faintly handsome. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes. "Hello, Wilson, old boy," said Tom, slapping him jovially on the shoulder. "How's business?" "I can't complain," said Wilson unconvincingly. "When are you going to sell me that car?" "Next week," said Tom. "I've got my man working on it now." "Works pretty slow, don't he?" "No, he doesn't," said Tom coldly. "And if you feel that way about it, maybe I better sell it to someone else after all." "I didn't mean that," Wilson explained hurriedly. I just mean that." His voice faded off. Tom glanced impatiently around the garage. Then I heard a footsteps on a stairs, and the thickish figure of a woman blocked out the light from the office door. She was in her middle 30s and faintly stout. But she wore her flesh sensuously, as some women can. Her face, above a dark blue dress of spotted crepuscine, contained no facet or gleam of beauty. But there was an immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if all the nerves of her body were continually smoldering. She smiled slowly, and walking through her husband as if he were a ghost, shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye. She wet her lips and, without turning around, spoke to her husband in a soft, coarse voice. "Get some chairs, why don't you, so somebody can sit down." "Oh, sure," Wilson said, hurrying off in the direction of the office, mingling immediately with the cement color of the walls. A white ashen dust veiled his dark suit and his hair, as it veiled everything in the vicinity, except his wife, who moved closer to Tom. "I want to see you," he said. "Get on the next train." She nodded. "We'll meet you on the lower level by the newsstand." "Want to meet you," he said. "Get on the next train." "All right. We'll meet you on the lower level by the newsstand." She nodded and moved away from Tom just as Wilson emerged from the office door holding 2 chairs. We waited for her down the road and out of sight. It was near the 4th of July, and we watched a scrawny gray Italian child sitting torpedoes along the railroad tracks. Terrible place, isn't it? Said Tom, exchanging a frown with Dr. Eckelberg. Awful. It does her good to get away. Doesn't her husband object? Wilson? He thinks she goes to see her sister in New York. He's so dumb he doesn't know he's alive. And so, Tom Buchanan, his girl, and I went together on the train to New York. Or not quite together, for Miss Wilson sat discreetly in another car. Tom deferred that much to the sensibility of those East Eggers who might have been on the train. Miss Wilson had changed her dress into a brown-figured muslin which stretched tightly over her rather wide hips as Tom helped her down to the platform in New York. At newsstand, she bought a copy of the Town Tattle and a moving pictures magazine. At the drugstore, she bought she bought some cold cream and a small flask of perfume. In solemn echoing drive, she let four taxi cabs go by before selecting a new one, lavender in color with gray upholstery. And in this, we moved out from the mass of the station into the glowing sunshine. Immediately, she turned sharply from the window and tapped on the glass. "I want to get one of those dogs," she said. "They're a nice thing for the apartment. They're a nice thing to have, a dog." We backed up to a gray old man who bore an absurd resemblance to John D. Rockefeller. And slung from his neck a basket of very recent puppies of an indeterminate breed. "What kind are they?" asked Miss Wilson eagerly. "All kinds," said the man. "What kind do you want, lady?" "I'd like to get one of those police dogs," she said earnestly. "I don't suppose you got that kind." The man peered into his basket doubtfully, plunged in a hand, and came up with one puppy. Came up with a dog wriggling by the back of the neck. "That's no police dog," said Tom. "No, it's not a police dog exactly," said the man with disappointment in his voice.